Welcome back once again at the Sandton Convention Center here in Johannesburg. My name is Tommy Dixon. We're building up to the plenary, the first on this second day of the CITES conference. The delegates are expected to come in at about 2 o'clock to hear some reports on the various meetings and discussions and the lobbyings that have been taking place since this morning. A lot of groups that have come in, the interest groups that are very much involved in issues of trade on wildlife and the stopping of the trade. A lot of interest groups that are here. I mean, there's variations of debates and issues that are going to be discussed. As we build up to the plenary this afternoon, we're going to continue picking up on some of these interest groups that are here and to hear actually their positions on the difficult issues that this conference is faced with. And part of it is really the selling of the ivory and as well as the rhino horns and other creatures that are actually available in many parts of the world. Now I have a pleasure of being joined in the set now by Mr. Azzedine Downes, who is the President and Chief Executive of International Fund for Animal Welfare. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the big issue here, obviously, it's about the big animals, the rhinos, the elephants, as they relate to the ivory. What is your view in terms of the legalization, which some people are calling for, of the ivories?
Our position really is that elephants and rhinos are worth much more alive than dead, and that the stopping of the killing of these animals, mostly from poaching for ivory or rhino horn, is extraordinarily complex. And when you speak to law enforcement officials, they say they don't want any gray area. They want it black and white. It's either legal or it's illegal. Anything in between is simply too difficult for them to sort out. So our position is, as long as elephants are being killed for their ivory, we don't want any trade in ivory.
Right. And that's the situation now, because I was listening to the other report that was done earlier on this morning in terms of the status of the elephant population in the world, that it's actually very much declining. And you suggest that it's a result of poaching.
Well, it actually is because of poaching. When you look at the numbers, some countries have lost 60% of their elephants in the last 2 or 3 years. Some countries 50%. So whilst it's true that some countries have large elephant populations, even those countries that have made the argument over 10, 20 years that their situation is much better, they're finding that they're having poaching. And that's true in southern Africa for the first time. So the situation is really, really serious. And I think that the arguments that some of the southern African countries who are pushing for more trade it needs to really be considered in the context of elephants are not just one country's animal. They move, transboundary issues. And that will only be made more complicated by things like climate change. So again, as I said, it needs to be a simple solution, and I think the best solution is simply stop the trade.
But what do you say to countries who are arguing that, look, we derive our sources of revenue from the wildlife? Some other countries in the African continent, especially in the southern region, they don't have big industries like the northern countries do have and the Western countries do have. The source of revenue actually comes from wildlife, and they've got enough to be able to sell. Why shouldn't they sell?
More money will come from tourism. At the opening of this conference, the figure was thrown out of how much hunting is worth. For example, I think the president said it was worth R1 billion. How much is tourism worth? I can tell you it's worth much, much, much more. The question about communities, we're very concerned about communities, and I'm personally very committed to ensuring that communities do, in fact, derive some sort of benefit from the wildlife. But that doesn't mean you need to kill them. I think, honestly, the idea of coming in, killing animals, selling ivory, it's really last century thinking. It really is. I'm concerned with finding ways where communities actually do derive some economic benefit. I'm absolutely not convinced that they do right now.
But then you've got an issue of demand as well. There's demand in Asia and elsewhere in Europe. In fact, there's also a demand for the ivory, and they are willing to buy this with an exorbitant prices as well. So how do you deal with the demand if you're only focusing on the supply?
Well, we also focus on the demand. We have a very large program in China where we are educating people about what it means. Now, we did polling and we found out that up to 80% of people in China believed that ivory came from elephants' teeth, because the translation is teeth, so that they thought the tusk fell out. If all ivory were coming from natural mortality, it wouldn't be an issue, but that's not the case. So China, huge market. United States, number two. United States has taken big measures this year to shut down domestic ivory trade, and China has announced that in fact they will take measures within a year to shut down domestic ivory trade. So if that happens, in fact, that's a signal to the countries that want to sell ivory that in fact there is no market. So why continue? Let's find other economic development mechanisms to really aid communities beyond simply throwing them the leftovers of an animal.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right. Well, those are some of the views that we continue going to hear from various delegates that are here, from various non-governmental organizations that are here. It's going to be a battlefield over the next 10 days with all these differing views and being expressed here, all of them lobbying for the positions, as you just heard now. Some they saying stop the killing of the rhinos, stop the killing of elephants, and some say stop the trading that is happening, whether it's a fair trade or it's a illegal trade, just stop it because it leads to the poaching and the killing of animals. So these are various views that are going to define really this gathering here. But with that, it's back to the studio.